ELA scholars, we're back with A Mighty Long Walk, chapter 8 today, titled Just a Matter of Time. Before we get into the reading, let's go over chapter 8 homework questions really quick. Chapter 8 runs through pages 141 through 162. You want to make sure you are annotating the text for incidents in Carlotta's life that help to shape her story and help her to make certain decisions. Go ahead here and provide 1 to 2 sentence just statement of the details in chapter 8. And then you have one homework question that states on page 162, Carlotta recounts Jefferson's first day of school in 1959. She refers to a decision that Elizabeth Eckford made that day when she writes, that decision was nothing short of brave and heroic. What decision is Carlotta referring to? Why does she think it is brave and heroic? Let's go ahead to the reading and you can follow along. Put your headphones on, get comfortable, get your highlighter and post-it notes. Chapter 8 of A Mighty Long Walk, Just a Matter of Time. My junior year at Central hadn't even started yet when the legal fight over integration began anew. The school board, persuaded that its initial efforts to integrate Central had been a dismal failure, returned to court over the summer to seek permission to change course. While the 9 of us were being hailed as heroes throughout the country, the board began its push to return us to the all black Horace Mann and delay integration until January 1961. There were new threats of violence, the board told the court, and the citizens of Little Rock needed more time to adjust to the inevitability of integration. Let's try that word again. Inevitability of integration. By then, the heroic Judge Davies had returned to North Dakota, and the case was assigned to an Arkansas based federal judge. I wasn't in court for the hearing, but I was stunned to learn on June 21st that U.S. District Judge Harry Limley granted the board's request for a delay. I wondered whether the clock would start ticking backward. Until that moment, the segregationists had been losing. The NAACP appealed immediately. When the case went before the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals in St. Louis in August, Thurgood Marshall returned with Wiley Branton to represent us. I was still away at camp, but it was a relief to hear that Marshall won the day. The appellate court reversed the Limley ruling. The school board wasn't ready to give in, though, and appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. When the new school year rolled around on September 2nd, 1958, the Tuesday after Labor Day, the city's 4 high schools remained closed. Once again, I was sitting at home in limbo, waiting for the nation's highest court to rule on the future of integration in Little Rock. 10 days later, the Supreme Court spoke. It took Chief Justice Earl Warren just 4 minutes to read the decision ordering Little Rock School District to proceed with integration. But Faubus was ready to counteract. He was even cockier than usual after having just won a Democratic nomination for his 3rd term. In Arkansas, that was tantamount to reelection, and Faubus was about to become the first governor in 50 years to serve more than 2 terms. The power seemed to intoxicate him. By the time the Supreme Court issued its order, Faubus had already called a special session of the state legislature and pushed through 6 anti-integration bills, which gave him extraordinary powers over the school system. Just hours after the Supreme Court announcement, Faubus made his stunning move. He signed the anti-integration bills into law and utilized his new power to shut down all 3 public high schools in Little Rock. And just like that, 3,700 students, black and white, were left wondering, what now? The news infuriated me. How dare the state's highest ranking political official jeopardize the futures of thousands of students? How was I going to complete my junior year now? Ernie had left for Michigan State. Minnie Jean was back in New York. And the parents of 2 of my other comrades had decided already that their families would take no more. They had already walked through hell and had no intention of looking back. Terry had moved to Los Angeles in August to stay with his paternal grandmother and other relatives. His parents and younger siblings would leave Little Rock for good and join him there by the end of the year. Gloria and her mother relocated around the same time to Kansas City, while her father maintained the family's home in Little Rock. That left Jefferson, Elizabeth, Thelma, Melba, and me. Mrs. Bates did her best to try to reassure us and our parents while we waited. I can still see the urgency on her face as she explained that we could take correspondence courses through the University of Arkansas. In the meantime, she promised, the NAACP will continue to fight for us. My own feelings were mixed, just as they had been when Minnie Jean first left for New York. I regretted that those of us who had been through so much together at Central wouldn't be able to finish our journey together. But I was happy that my comrades were moving on to more peaceful lives. 5 of the 9, Terry, Minnie, Melba, Elizabeth, and Thelma, were all seniors now. This was to be their final year at Central, but from all appearances, the battle was not even close to resolution. Faubus regularly strutted before the television cameras to justify his decision, as if upsetting the lives of so many were a perfectly reasonable thing to do. The results of a local election he called in September gave him even more confidence that white Little Rock stood with him. In that election, Little Rock voters were asked whether they wanted complete integration or none at all. The ballot provided for nothing in between, so the outcome was no surprise. 70% of the voters chose none at all. Through it all, though, my family never talked about leaving Little Rock, at least as far as I knew. Perhaps to my parents, the idea of leaving their large, extended families and everything they have ever known was scarier than the prospect of facing another uncertain year at Central. My parents probably would have considered sending me temporarily to St. Louis, Kansas City, Chicago, or other cities where we had close relatives. But Mrs. Bates asked those of us who remained to stay in town. We might be needed in court, she said. At first, that was fine with me. Now, the thought of going to school in another city at times seemed enticing and adventurous. I felt a strong need to stay close to my parents and sisters. I felt guilty because I saw how much my family was struggling, and I knew it was because of my decision to attend Central. With Daddy having trouble earning a steady paycheck, Mother had gotten a job working for the city. I wanted to do my part, so I took on the responsibility of caring for Tina, who was 3 years old. Families like mine weren't the only ones suddenly scrambling after the school closings to figure out what to do. The school board also had to act quickly to keep teachers from abandoning the system in masse. To quell the teachers' fears, the board agreed to continue paying them. Then, when an uproar rose from the community over the prospect of a year without football, the board, without the support of the governor, made provisions for the season to continue. So even though thousands of families were scurrying to find academic alternatives for their children, teachers were reporting to empty classrooms, and the football teams practiced and played a regular schedule. The most galling development of all, though, occurred just 5 days after Faubus closed the high schools. The governor had the nerve to announce on television that Little Rock Private School Corporation, a group of segregationists, would be allowed to lease the public schools. I was appalled. Did Faubus really think he could get away with allowing white parents to rent the public schools just for their children? Did he really believe he was slick enough to undermine a U.S. Supreme Court order in this way? Fortunately, the NAACP, supported by the Department of Justice, quickly secured an injunction and bulldozed the plan, at least part of it. The corporation remained intact and ultimately purchased the former University of Arkansas Graduate Center for its school. The group also managed to hire teachers from outside the city after its efforts to hire public school teachers failed. With everything in place, the segregationists opened their whites only school in late October and eventually enrolled about 900 students. However, by the beginning of 1959, at least 675 students were not enrolled in school or correspondence courses anywhere, according to a magazine article that Superintendent Blossom later wrote. Those students just dropped out of school and settled for low paying jobs. I'm sure Faubus lost no sleep worrying about them because the majority of them, Those hit hardest and hurt the most by his foolish acts were Black. Even though my parents were struggling financially, they were determined to keep me on schedule academically. So they scraped up the extra money to pay for the correspondence courses and rent the textbooks. So, too, did the families of Jefferson, Elizabeth, Thelma, and Melba, who also took the courses. The Dunbar Community Center arranged for students in the community who wanted to do our schoolwork together to meet there every day and get help from retired teachers and volunteers from the local library. Every day, Mother dropped Tina and me off at the center as though we were going to school. For half a day, I did my correspondence work. My first two courses were U.S. History 2 and English 2, and the assignments came in white folders from the Division of General Education at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. Each folder contained a form letter that provided basic information, such as the name and address of my instructor. 24 assignments were enclosed in each pocket, but I was instructed complete no more than 4 per week. I quickly found that those 4 assignments didn't amount to nearly enough work to keep my mind occupied. Once I was scolded for returning too many lessons at one time. Several times I received a bright yellow slip of paper notifying me that because of increased enrollment in the courses, I was being assigned a new teacher. The note assured me that the change would not affect my progress in the course or my grade. That happened so frequently, it was hard to keep up with who, if anyone, was seriously evaluating my work. Except for the occasional correction of a misspelled word or a brief question asking for additional information, the teacher rarely made notes on my papers. Most times, the only indication that anyone had even looked at my assignment was a grade at the top of the page, usually an A. After I had completed the required 2 dozen assignments, an examination was mailed to me, and my grade was based on my proficiency on the test. I kept my papers from that time, and they remind me to this day how empty those days felt. I do, however, look back fondly on them, on the fun. On a typical day, about 10 to 15 students showed up, and it was good to be engaged with other teenagers. I missed learning, but I didn't miss the stress or isolation I'd experienced the first year at Central. At the center, most of us were done with our serious work by lunchtime, and we whiled away the afternoons at the card table. I'd hold Tina on my lap as we played bid whist, checkers, dominoes, and Scrabble. When teenagers walked a lot of noise and often spelled words, let's start that sentence over. Sorry, the phone's ringing. When teenagers talked a lot of noise, we teenagers talked a lot of noise and often spelled words we thought the little one shouldn't hear. But Tina, ever a quick study, not only picked up a lifelong affection and talent for cards and board games, she also quickly became a master speller. You could just see that phonetic wheel twirling in her brain as she tried to figure out what she was supposed to hear. It became almost a game to her to outsmart the big kids, then blurt out our disguised words. Despite the fun, I knew I was supposed to be in school, and I couldn't help worrying about my future, about how much my chances of getting into a good college would hurt by these long months out of school. But there were worries far beyond me. Elsewhere in Little Rock, the city's economy was suffering. Not only was Little Rock's population declining, but no new industry was moving in. From the fall of 1957 until the start of 1959, not a single new company decided to move to Little Rock industrial area. Even those companies with previous plans to open plants in Little Rock canceled those arrangements once the 101st Airborne Division set up a shop in the city. The city was bleeding, and others were starting to feel the pain. Much of white Little Rock blamed Mrs. Bates and our parents for the crisis. Faubus encouraged those sentiments with his rhetoric. If Daisy Bates would find an honest job and go to work, and if the U.S. Supreme Court would keep its cotton picking hands off the Little Rock School Board's affairs, we could open the Little Rock schools, he declared. A group calling itself Save Our Schools Committee also perpetuated the notion that our parents and Mrs. Bates were at fault. In mid September 1958, the group began running a series of newspaper ads encouraging Black ministers and other Black community leaders to appeal to Mrs. Bates and 7 parents to give us time to accept this change in a Christian manner. It never ceased to amaze me how often the bigots try to hide their fear and hatred behind the banner of Christianity. So at the end of the year, I started to see stories on television and newspapers about another group of white women calling themselves the Women's Emergency Committee to Open Our Schools, WEC, led by Adolphine Terry, Vivian Brewer, and Velma Powell, the wife of one of Central's vice principals. They tried to become a voice of reason among whites in the community. The group's policy statement reflected the balance the women were hoping to strike. We stand neither for integration nor for segregation, but for education, the statement read. The group outlined a fourfold purpose: to get the free public high schools reopened, to get students back in their classes, to retain the staff of good teachers, and to regain full accreditation by the North Central Association. Behind the scenes, the committee also became a political force. When the existing school board resigned in mid November 1958, the committee was largely responsible for recruiting moderates to run for the six vacant positions. That set up a race pitting the moderates against segregationist candidates who supported the governor's position. As fate would have it, the election resulted in a split board: three moderates and three segregationists. One of the new board's first major actions was to fire Superintendent Blossom without cause and without prejudice in December 1958. When teachers returned again to empty classrooms the following January, rumors began circulating that the board was planning a purge of teachers. Faubus said publicly he thought Central's principal, Jess Matthews, and the two vice principals, Mrs. Huckabee and Mr. Powell, should be fired. Mr. Powell had angered segregationists when he participated as a guest panelist at a session sponsored by his wife and the Women's Emergency Committee. Rumor had it that Mr. Powell was at the top of the list of those to go, but he instead quit and took another job in California. As I watched much of this unfold in the newspapers and on television, I changed my mind about staying in Little Rock. I was tired of politics. I just wanted to be in school, even if it meant moving to another city for a while. Besides, by the beginning of the year, I had completed all of the correspondence courses I could take in one semester, and I was seriously bored. I heard that Mrs. Bates has sent out an appeal asking NAACP supporters in other cities to take in Black Little Rock students interested in relocating to finish their high school education. One such offer came from a white couple in Santa Rosa, California, who were dedicated to racial justice and wanted to become a surrogate family to a displaced Black student. Mrs. Bates arranged for Melba to move to the West Coast to live with the couple and their four children. I also began hearing about Horace Mann students who were being placed in other homes throughout the country. I wonder why Mrs. Bates kept passing me up for such opportunities. One day I was bold enough to ask Mrs. Bates and Mrs. Bates reiterated that she wanted me to stay close in case I was needed in court. Perhaps she could tell from my facial expression that I wasn't too happy with that response because she soon had a change of heart. In late March 1959, she called to tell my parents that Dr. Nathan Christopher, an NAACP board member in Cleveland, had invited a Little Rock student to stay with his family and finish high school there. This time, Mrs. Bates was extending the invitation to me. Mother and Daddy discussed it and agreed that the time may have come for me to go away to school, but they let me decide whether I wanted to go to Cleveland. Of course, the decision for me was easy. The offer couldn't have come at a better time, and by the beginning of April, I was off to Cleveland for my new adventure. I liked the Christophers immediately. They were a sophisticated couple who appeared to be in their early 60s. Nathan Christopher was a prominent Black dentist, very mild mannered and easygoing. I soon learned one of his favorite pastimes was fishing in Canada. His wife, Ida, was the more outgoing of the two, a tall, authoritative woman who owned a couple of businesses and often fronted the capital to help young Black business owners open their flower shops, beauty salons, and corner stores. She traveled in powerful political circles and easily held her own among the men who sat with her on a dozen or so boards and commissions. She was a big woman who wore bottle thick glasses that only slightly improved her vision, which had been practically destroyed by cataracts. Because of her poor eyesight, she was no longer supposed to drive. I helped drive her around, cook occasionally, and perform light chores. The couple had both a maid and a cook, so my chores didn't amount to much more than I already did at home. This kind of arrangement was fairly common among Black families of means who were deeply committed to giving back to the community. I'd seen it close up in my own family because my great uncle John Collins, the older brother of Grandpa Collins, and his wife took in students from Philander Smith. Uncle John's own children were grown, so he provided the college students free housing, food, and tuition assistance in exchange for their helping out around the house. I was the 11th student the Christophers had welcomed into their home over the years. After raising their daughter and son into adulthood, the couple had committed their lives to nurturing the dreams of other Black children, particularly those from families of lesser means who could benefit from the stability and guidance of two accomplished and well connected professionals. Their home was an elegant flat, about 2,500 square feet on the second floor of a 3-story, 6-unit brick complex they owned. The building sat on East Boulevard in the upper middle class, mostly white neighborhood across from a nice park. I slept in a room that had been built as the maid quarters, just off the kitchen in the back of the apartment. It was comfortable, though nothing fancy. But the rest of the home was exquisitely decorated. Mrs. Christopher changed the furniture, particularly in the living and dining areas, every 2 years. She would call in movers to haul out the pieces she no longer wanted, and with little or no notice, a moving van loaded with her expensive furnishings would show up at her daughter's place on the other side of the city to unload. I remember her daughter sort of rolling her eyes one day as she told me about a delivery her mother recently had sent. Because of where the Christophers lived, I was able to enroll in East High, an integrated but predominantly white high school in the neighborhood. It was one of the best schools in the city, and fortunately for me, none of my peers knew my story. There, I was just another student going to class trying to keep up with my schoolwork. After the year I'd experienced at Central, it felt good to go to school without being noticed. The other students were friendly enough, but I didn't develop any lasting relationships, in part because I had little time to get together with my peers outside of school. Most of my evenings were spent behind the wheel of Mrs. Christopher's huge navy blue Lincoln, shuttling her from one meeting to another. But I rather enjoyed hanging out in the background of her life and watching quietly as this strong, smart Black woman negotiated, gave orders, and made things happen. In some way, she was the female version of my grandfather's, tough and resourceful. In her, I saw possibilities for myself. Back then, I always liked spending time with older people like Mrs. Christopher because I believed they could teach me something. I sometimes learned by just watching how they handled themselves. I also enjoyed listening to their stories. Plus, I was very comfortable around them. So when mother sent a letter containing the telephone number of my great aunt Maud, I seized the opportunity. Maud Warren, then 66, was the only one of Papa Holloway's siblings who had stayed in touch with him. Like my great grandfather, she had taken a different road from that of the rest of her brother and sisters by claiming her colored roots. I called her right away and asked if I could visit. To my surprise, I learned she lived just blocks from the Christophers, close enough for me to walk. The next afternoon, I walked the several blocks to her house. As soon as Aunt Maud stepped to the door, I saw the Holloway resemblance. She was tall and thin with tan skin, narrow feathers, and long. Once jet black hair mingled with gray. We greeted each other cordially, but no hugs. The Holloways aren't giving to demonstrative displays of affection. I followed her to the living room where we sat and talked between long moments of silence. Like Papa Holloway, Aunt Maud didn't talk much, and she held her past close to the vest. She asked about our family, Uncle Teet, and a couple of Papa Holloway's other children whom she knew by name. She had met only the few relatives who stopped by while traveling through Cleveland. She had never traveled to Little Rock, not even for Papa Holloway's funeral the year before. After a while, I asked if she knew any of her other brothers and sisters, the ones passing for white. At first, she didn't answer. I had a chance to ask again later, thinking that maybe she didn't hear me. No, she replied softly. I don't know where the others are. I didn't push. A few moments later, Aunt Ma introduced me to her son, Ali, when he walked into the room. He was as quiet as a ghost, with a shock of prematurely gray hair. Family members told me that he lived with his mother because he had been unable to steady his life after serving in World War II. After about an hour with Aunt Maud, it was time for me to leave. I thanked her for allowing me to visit and headed back to my temporary home. Along the way, I thought about Papa Holloway, how much I missed him, and how happy it would have made him to know that I had visited his sister. I returned for another short visit with Aunt Maud, but my time in Cleveland ran out sooner than I had expected. I had been living with the Christophers just 1 month when Mrs. Christopher called me into her room for a chat. She had never summoned me like this before, so I figured the matter must be serious. As I walked to her room, I quickly reviewed the past few days in my head, wondering if I had forgotten to take care of something she had requested or whether I might have done something she did not like. Nothing came to mind. When I walked into the bedroom, Mrs. Christopher was sitting on the edge of her bed. She wore a smile that told me she wasn't upset with me, but the mood was less than happy. I took a seat in the Queen Anne style wingback chair across from her and braced myself as she began to speak. She and her husband really liked me, she said, but I wasn't exactly the kind of student she had requested. I clearly wasn't deprived or lacking in social grace and skills, she said. I had been blessed with good, solid parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles who were perfectly capable of providing whatever guidance I needed henceforth. She said she believed there were other students who might benefit more from her and her husband's help. She was very warm, almost apologetic. She didn't ask me to leave, but I figured that would be best. I knew how important it was to her to feel that she was making a difference by providing an opportunity that a young person might not otherwise have. I didn't want to stand in the way of that. Mrs. Christopher had some other ideas for me, though. She didn't think I should return to Little Rock or Central. I was smart and mature enough to skip the rest of high school and start college as early as the coming summer, she said. She sat on the board of Ferris State College in Big Rapids, Michigan, and she assured me that I could get in. I wasn't so sure. My gut told me that I wasn't quite ready for college. After an entire year of school, I believed I needed more math and science to have a chance at success in college. But I told Mrs. Christopher that I would discuss it with my parents and think about it. Mother and Daddy were flattered that a woman of Mrs. Christopher's stature thought I was ready for college, but they too had some concerns. We didn't rush into a decision. I applied to Ferris State and we kept our options open. During our frequent conversations and letters over the next several weeks, Mother and Daddy kept me abreast of the political changes taking place in Little Rock. A recall election in May resulted in a new school board with a majority of moderates who proclaimed that Central would reopen in the fall. One of the moderates was a man named Rhett Tucker, whose son I get to know many years later. The votes of the city's black residents and affluent, well educated white residents had made the difference, my parents said. By mid May, I received word that I had been accepted to Ferris State, but I decided not to go. My parents and I agreed that I should return to Little Rock to get my high school diploma because I needed to hone the academic skills required for college. But for me, there was an even greater need. I have been through too much over the past nearly 2 years, so had my family, for me to just walk away empty handed. I needed my high school diploma and I needed to earn it from Central. That accomplishment, I believed, was the least I could achieve now. Anything short of that would have felt like failure to me. The problem was, even with the corresponding courses in my 2 months at East High, I was still short of the credits that would be needed to complete the 11th grade at Central. I needed to attend summer school. My parents arranged for me to spend the summer with relatives in Chicago and attend summer school there. In early June, I packed my bags, thanked the well meaning Christophers for their generosity and kindness, and boarded a train bound for the Windy City. Waiting for me there were my great aunt, Emmy Collins Beard, and her husband, Elmer. I called her Aunt Emmy. I never knew what the initials represented. She said they didn't stand for anything. She was the youngest sister of Grandpa Cullens, my maternal grandfather, and she reminded me so much of Mother. Aunt Emmy had no children of her own, but all her nieces she clearly favored Mother. She even called Mother her pride and joy. The two of them resembled each other so closely they could easily have been mistaken for mother and daughter. Mother had picked me up some of our aunt's ways too, particularly her keen sense of fashion. Aunt Emmy was an avid reader of Vogue magazine and always looked as though she had stepped right off its pages. She wasn't just a fashion plate, though. She had attended Philander Smith taught school and worked as a secretary at one of the insurance companies located in the historic Mosaic Templar building on West 9th Street in Little Rock. She had moved to Chicago from St. Louis after meeting and marrying Elmer Beard, her third husband. They lived in the 7900 block of South Indiana Street on the south side, a typical Chicago suburb with neatly trimmed trees and well kept lawns and families headed by hard-working professional blue collar mothers and fathers. The next door neighbor was a dentist. Many of the neighbors were former black Southerners who had headed north, following kin who'd been part of the so called Great Migration of the early 20th century. They had come to break free of the stranglehold that Jim Crow had on the places of their birth. They had come in search of opportunities touted by the Chicago Defender, one of the most widely read black newspapers throughout the South. They had come in search of jobs in Chicago steel mills, meat packing houses, and railroads, and the opportunity to learn, eat, and travel as freely as any white man or woman. They had come with nothing but their sheer will and ingenuity, a kind of industriousness that, I might add, was not always appreciated by their citified black brethren, who complained behind closed doors about the ruin the country folk were bringing to the neighborhoods. An article that ran during the summer in the Chicago Defender poked fun at the black Southerners, who were said to pull old bed springs stripped of their coverings onto their yards, dig holes in the ground for their coal, barbecue on the wire springs, and litter their lawns with chicken bones. A line from the story became a running joke between Uncle Elmer and me. Purposely written in dialect, he said something like, in don't care whether he moaned. I was too young to understand the danger of stereotypes or the irony that white folks often painted all black folks with the same broad brush. At the time, the line just seemed plain funny, and Uncle Elmer and I would look knowingly at each other, mouth those words, and crack up if we spotted the least bit of evidence of its truth. I soon had to share the time I spent with Uncle Elmer, Aunt Emmy, with my cousin Dolores Warren, who came from Little Rock to join me. The women in the family thought I'd need someone my age to keep me company. But having company was too often nerve wracking. Dolores, then 15, wasn't in summer school, and she watched television all day until I got home. She had a sassy mouth and talked back to Aunt Emmy. She also used to sneak to the bowling alley in the evenings to see her boyfriend, John Smith, who was a few years older and already in college. John was from Little Rock but had come to Chicago that summer with his friend, Al Bell, the same Al Bell who go on to become the head honcho at Stax Records. Years later, Stax will compete with the legendary Motown for the soul of black music. Al and John were as close as brothers. Al had lived with John's family in Little Rock throughout high school and college, and his tenure as a popular young DJ at KOKY, the local station to cater to black listeners. Al had come to Chicago to be close to his girlfriend, Mavis Staples, of the famous Staples Singers, and John tagged along so that he could spend time with Dolores. Aunt Emmy thought the Lovebirds were far too serious for their age, particularly her 15-year-old niece. Before John arrived in Chicago, his letters to Dolores had come addressed to Mrs. John Smith. The two indeed became husband and wife several years later, and Al brought John into Stax as high-powered executive. But in the summer of 1959, John was just a college boy with uncertain motives in my aunt's eyes, and she didn't want him at her house. I became the excuse for Dolores to get to the bowling alley to see John. I never bowled before in Little Rock, but it became one of my favorite new pastimes. I was thrilled for the chance to get out of the house, especially when the sparks were flying between Dolores and Aunt Emmy. Dolores was the type who pushed the envelope, and I often got caught in that awkward spot in the middle when my aunt said to her, "Why aren't you more like Carlotta?" I have to admit, I was more than a bit happy when Dolores received a train ticket back to Little Rock from her mother. My little aunt Lualis, my great aunt, is Big Lualis, thanks to the confusing family tradition of passing along first names. At least with Dolores gone, I didn't have to hear my elders comparing my cousin to me. I sometimes felt tremendous pressure to live up to everyone's expectations, my family members, Mrs. Bates, the NAACP. I wanted never to disappoint any of them. Most times that wasn't difficult. My nature leaned toward following the rules and doing the right thing. But that summer, I was a 16-year-old music lover in a real music town with temptations at practically every corner of the stretch I walked to and from school. I attended summer school at Hirsch High, about a mile from my aunt and uncle's home. My classes began at 8 a.m. and ended at noon, just about the time that my route along 79th Street began to sizzle. I mean, it was sizzling, literally hot as heck outside, but the music scene was just as hot. In those days, the record stores blasted the latest music through huge speakers that filled the walkways with the soulful sounds of rhythm and blues, rock and roll, and jazz. Everywhere I walked, it seemed I heard Brooke Benton's smooth baritone flowing through the speakers, heating up the already hot outdoors. His hit, "It Just a Matter of Time," was topping the R&B charts that summer. That's probably what first drew me into the record shop. But once I realized the place was air conditioned, it gave me another excuse to stop there every day on the way home. I'd wander around the store listening to Lloyd Price tell the story of the barroom gambler who lost all his money and then settled the score with his 44 in the chart topping Stagger Lee, or that acrobatic voice of Jackie Wilson would be crooning lonely teardrops. Fats Domino would start pleading in "I Want to Walk You Home," or jazz great Ahmad Jamal would take me to heaven, gliding up and down the piano in his sensational Poinciana. I love that number to this day. I lingered in that record store listening, losing track of time, sorting through the LPs of some of my favorite artists: Little Richard, The Platters, Elvis, and the original Queen of Soul, Dinah Washington. One day while walking home, I noticed a sign that Donna would be appearing at a popular Southside club called the Robert Show Lounge. I had to be there. All of a sudden, it didn't matter that I was just 16 or that I probably have to scheme to get there. This felt like the chance of a lifetime that I intended to take full advantage. It helped that I had made some pretty cool friends who were older than me, but a generation younger than Aunt Emmy and Uncle Elmer. One of them was my cousin Doris, who was from Little Rock but had recently moved to Chicago to teach after Marion Lowell Zoller, who was working in a biology lab there. Doris and Lowell were eventually became doctors, helped to show me a grand time in Chicago. So did Uncle Elmer's children from a prior marriage, Sue and Elmer Jr., and their spouses. I grew particularly close to Sue, who was a teacher, and her husband, George Love, who worked in the Exxon plant. They had moved in with Aunt Emmy and Uncle Elmer for a month during my time there, while waiting to move into their own house in another area of the South Side that was just starting to open to Black residents. Sue and George were lenient with me and helped to bridge the generational gap between me and their parents. When I saw the Dinah Washington sign, I knew I could rely on Sue and George to cover for me. There was no cover at the door, and I just slid in with the crowd. I always acted older, and my height made me look older too, so I didn't stand out. I didn't drink or draw attention to myself. I just sat in that grand lounge which had hundreds of seats around a huge stage. A big crystal ball hanging in the middle of the room mesmerized me as much as the queen herself. As though crystals glittered and bounced off the ceiling, Dinah belted with every so perfect timing and precision. What a difference a day made. 24 little hours. Talk about Hollywood. Dinah took me there that night. It wasn't the last time Sue and George helped me witness what would become legendary Chicago music history. Later that summer, when I saw billboards advertising the first ever Playboy Jazz Festival, I gave Sue the $3.70 or so I'd been saved by walking instead of riding the bus to school to buy my ticket. The event was being sponsored by Hugh Hefner and his then 5-year-old Playboy magazine, so I'm sure I had no business there. But even as a teenager, I become something of a jazz aficionado. My parents were jazz lovers. They traveled with other couples to St. Louis for spring musical review called the Wise Circus, which featured a number of jazz artists. Mother and Daddy would bring home the music of Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Billie Holiday, Sarah Vaughan, Joe Williams, Pearl Bailey, Eartha Kitt, Ella Fitzgerald, Earl Father Hines, all the popular jazz artists of the day. One of them was always riffing in the background of our lives at home. So, how was I supposed to resist when I saw on the billboard that practically all of my favorite jazz artists would be at the Playboy Jazz Festival August 7th through the 9th in Chicago Stadium? Sue and George again helped cover for me and told me how to take the bus to the west side for one of the best days of my life. When I got to the stadium, I struck up a conversation with a police officer and palmed him my ticket in the nosebleed section, and he let me slip onto the floor for an unbelievable view. I could hardly believe my luck as I stood there, soaking up the best music I'd ever heard in my life. Count Basie, Joe Williams, and a group that I had seen the summer before in New York, Lambert, Hendrix, and Ross. Joe was the featured singer for Basie, and the trio came out as a backup on a couple of numbers. Now that was real music. Near the end of the show, out comes a guy with his hat cocked a certain way, singing Angel Eyes, just like old Blue Eyes himself. He brought down the house. Everybody thought the man was Frank Sinatra. As it turned out, he was an imitator, a heck of a good one, though. Anyway, the show was a real thrill. It made my summer. As the summer wound down, my parents told me that the federal courts ruled the high school closings had been illegal. The high schools in Little Rock could reopen. Suddenly, there was no more time to lose, and school officials were rushing to start the new school year early. The opening of the 1959-1960 session, my senior year, was set to begin August 12th, 3 weeks earlier than the traditional school opening after Labor Day. Unfortunately, summer school wouldn't end until the third week in August, and I would miss the grand reopening of Central. I stayed in close touch with my parents and Mrs. Bates, who told me that Gloria would remain in Kansas City to finish her senior year. By then, Minnie and Terrence had graduated from the high schools they had attended in other cities. Melba was preparing to take courses at San Francisco State University, and Elizabeth and Thelma had completed their senior year mostly through correspondence courses. Of the original Little Rock Nine, just two were left to return to Central, Jefferson and I. I was quite surprised to learn that even after 2 years of racial unrest over school integration in Little Rock, 60 black students had applied to go to white high schools when they reopened. School officials accepted only 8, 3 at the formerly all white Hall High School and 5 at Central. The 5 students to go to Central included Sybil Jordan, Frank Henderson, Sandra Johnson, Jefferson, and I. If anyone had any illusions that things would be different in the upcoming school year or that the segregationists had fully given up their fight, those thoughts surely must have evaporated on the first day of school. I was finishing up summer school in Chicago on the morning of August 12th when back home in Little Rock, a caravan of segregationists from all over the state and elsewhere in the South descended on Arkansas State Capitol grounds to hear Fabius make a speech. Family members told me how the governor fired up the crowd with his anti integration rhetoric and how the streets feel afterward with an angry mob headed for Central. I could just imagine them singing their own resistance anthem as they had 2 years before. In Arkansas, in the state of Cotton, federal courts are good and rotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. But a new police chief was in charge, Eugene G. Smith. I remember Chief Smith from 1957 school year because as assistant chief then, he was the one who had ordered his officers to get us out of Central the day the mob took control. Smith, who was considered a moderate, apparently had determined there would be no repeat of that day this time around. According to news reports, he had both the police and fire departments on alert. He used a megaphone to order the crowd to disperse, but the protesters paid him no mind. His officers even had to use nightsticks to defend themselves against the crowd. When the crowd got more unruly, Smith ordered firemen to open their hoses, unleashing a torrent of water streaming onto the crowd at half blast. When Eugene Bull Connor would apply that same controversial tactic years later on civil rights marches in Birmingham, many of whom were children, he ordered the hoses turned to full blast, powerful enough to strip bark from trees. Before the Little Rock officers were able to restore calm, about 2 dozen troublemakers were arrested. Smith's actions that day would linger in the minds of segregationists who bumped him even higher on their list of most hated public enemies. Such hatred would raise suspicions ever more in Little Rock's black community in the days ahead, when Smith's career as a law enforcement officer would come to an astonishing and mysterious end. About an hour after the mob quieted, Jeff walked up to the steps of Central to begin his senior year. He was accompanied by one who knew better than anyone else what it was like to stand alone in the midst of a hateful mob. Our comrade, Elizabeth Eckford. Elizabeth had finished her high school coursework through correspondence courses, but she knew I was still out of town and did not want Jeff to face the mob alone. That decision was nothing short of brave and heroic. It touches me still. Finally, summer school was over and it was time for me to leave Chicago. Aunt Emmy and Uncle Elmer bought me an airline ticket so that I could make it back to Little Rock in a hurry. They even upgraded the ticket so that I could get a meal on the plane. I was excited to be headed home to see my family after 5 long months away. But even more, I looked forward to returning to Central. There was something I needed to finish. Wow, that's the end of chapter 8 class. And I'll be back with chapter 9 when it's time. Go ahead and get your chapter 8 homework completed.